everybody, it's SaskiaSketches, and today I have a controversial question to ask. Is tracing ever okay? I've given this much thought and I've come to the conclusion that there are 3 different circumstances in which tracing is okay. Now, before you get out your pitchforks in the comment section, please hear me out first. I know that this is a controversial topic. Obviously, I'm not saying tracing over someone's work and passing it off as your own is okay. That is never, ever justifiable, and it's not the kind of tracing that I'm trying to defend here. First, we need to look at what the difference is between tracing and referencing. Using reference to create your work is very, very important if you want to learn and improve. Personally, I prefer to use as much first-hand reference as possible. I hardly ever use other people's artwork as reference, but some people do, and that's fine. The dictionary definition of tracing is to copy a drawing, map, or design by drawing over its lines on a superimposed piece of transparent paper. And in digital art, you can do the same, just with a new layer on top of the original image. Meanwhile, referencing is a lot more flexible. To reference means to look at a real-life object, a photograph, someone else's artwork, anything really, and to create art based on it by making artistic choices informed by observing, analysing, and studying the reference. Tracing is often seen as a mindless and cheap way of producing an image that requires little to no artistic skill, whereas referencing is seen as more productive. When you're using a reference, you're actively learning and honing your artistic skill, as well as expanding your visual library. Let me ask you, how is heavily referencing or copying a reference different from tracing? And why is one considered fair game and the other condemned? It's the intent behind it. When someone is heavily referencing a photograph, and although they might be drawing freehand, their goal is to make something that looks as close to the original image as possible, but it's with the intent to understand and learn from the original image. Generally, people are more open about using reference. When someone is tracing, they are copying the image without thinking to make something that looks as closely to the original image as possible, and sometimes with the intent to pass it off as their own. Generally, they are more secretive about it. Tracing is taboo in the art community because it implies art theft. And like I said before, tracing over someone else's work, whether that is a drawing or a photograph, with the intent to pass it off as your own is never okay. However, I think there are a few justifiable uses for tracing in art. Tracing is a tool, just like referencing, but it's one that should be wielded with much caution. Tracing etiquette will vary from person to person, but when tracing, there are a few guidelines to observe, just like with referencing. Be open. This one should be obvious, but when you trace, be open about it. Never try to hide the fact that you've traced. When people find out, and trust me, it's easy to find out, people will start to wonder whether all of your other work is traced as well. Trace loosely. If the vast majority of your work is freehand, you're likely in the clear. Only trace things you'll be able to draw freehand as well. It is important that you don't become reliant on tracing. It should be used to speed up your process rather than to bring your art to a new level. Consider asking the owner of the original work whether you're allowed to trace over it. Now, let's get into the 3 circumstances in which I think tracing is okay. The first one is tracing to practice. This, just like studying a reference, should be done with the intent to learn from it, to understand the subject matter and to learn from the original image. This is a heavy and obvious form of tracing, and it is incredibly important to be open about this use of tracing. If you're going to post these studies online, which I do not recommend, I think it would only be fair to tag the original artist in a post, and even better, to ask them if you can trace and post the artwork up front. Respect the original artist's wishes. If they don't want you to trace over their work and post it, even to study, then don't. Secondly, is tracing your own photographs and or art. Because you own the original work, you're allowed to do whatever you want with it. That includes tracing. If you have your own permission to trace the image, by all means, go ahead. Lastly is tracing things you could have drawn freehand to speed up your process, which is what I did with this piece. I spent hours on the composition, meticulously gathering many reference images and distributing them across the canvas, resizing, cropping, mirroring, etc. And I put a lot of effort into this composition. And although I could have used my usual sketching method to lay out and transfer the composition, instead I opted to loosely trace the most important elements of the composition. This composition is mine, these images are not. I'm tracing over the composition here, as well as over the images, but my intent here is not to recreate any of the photographs as closely as possible. My intent here is to map out the composition, and that is a very big difference. My reasoning for this was that I could get a very similar result when doing this freehand as opposed to tracing, but it would have taken much longer. The rest of my drawing is completely freehand. Lastly, I want to address the notion that tracing won't help you improve as much as using references. Whereas this is true to a certain extent, it all depends on how you use these tools of tracing and referencing. Some artists will improve a lot more from tracing than they would from referencing because they're able to use the tracing tool much more effectively than the referencing tool. And for some artists, it's the other way around. Again, it's all about intent. Why are you tracing? Why are you referencing? Are you studying, analysing and observing, or just blindly following? Is your goal to pass the work off as your own, or to create something unique? All these are important questions. Yes, tracing can only help you improve so much. That's personally why I use it very sparingly, like the example I mentioned here. Once every couple months, if not once every few years. I know something in art that I've always found and still find difficult is proportion. If I trace all my first sketch layers, I won't improve nearly as much on my use of proportion as when I'm doing all my first sketch layers freehand, which is what I normally do. Sometimes, however, in scenarios like the one I mentioned before, I weigh the benefits of freehand against the benefits of tracing, and tracing comes out on top. Yes, I can spend hours and maybe get a little bit better at proportions, or I can do it in 20 minutes and practice proportions some other time in a more effective way. Most importantly, art for me is about enjoying creating. I only trace in some very rare specific circumstances because I don't like tracing. I don't think it's very fun, and personally, I much prefer freehand drawing because that's what I enjoy about art. But sometimes, like for this piece, the freehand aspect, in this instance, the mapping out of the composition, might be tedious and unenjoyable, and in those circumstances I might opt to trace. I would never have done this if it wasn't my own composition, and I want to make that very clear. My intent here was not to copy one specific photograph to pass it off as my own. My intent was to transfer my composition, the one that I came up with, so that I could get to the fun part of the drawing, which was the freehand sketching and colouring. Or I guess the values, since it's black and grey. Anyway, that's all I have to say on this matter. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments, on points I raised, as well as what you think about scripted content. I always do my voiceovers off the cuff. I don't remember the last time I used a script, but I just wanted to try something new. I'm curious to hear what you guys thought of it. Maybe I'll do this again in the future. That's it for now. Thank you guys so much for watching this video all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to this YouTube channel for more art videos every single Friday. Have a great weekend guys and keep on sketching. Bye!